I'm back, boys and girls, and Miss Schlins is very excited about reading chapter 4 of As the Red Fern Grows. It's an exciting chapter. Bear with me. I'm trying to read and show you the pictures that go along with each page and turn the page. So manipulating all three of these early this morning, it's a little rough, but we're going to do the best we can. So here I go, chapter 4. Day after day, I flew to the store. Grandpa would shake his head. Then on Monday, as I entered the store, I sensed a change in him. He was in high spirits, talking and laughing with a half a dozen farmers. Every time I caught his eye, he would smile and wink at me. I thought the farmers would never leave, but finally the store was empty. Grandpa told me the letter had come. The kennels were still there, and they had dogs for sale. He said he had made the mail buggy wait while he made the order out. And another thing, the dog market had gone downhill. The price of the dogs had dropped by $5. He handed me a $10 bill. Now, there's still one stump in your way, he said. The mail buggy can't carry things like dogs, so they'll come as far as the depot in Tahlequah. But you'll get the notice here because I ordered them in your name. I asked my grandfather with all of my heart, and I thanked my grandfather with all of my heart and asked him how long I'd have to wait for the notice. He said, I don't know, it shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks. I asked how I was going to get my dogs from Tahlequah. Well, there's always someone going in, he said, and you could ride in with them. That evening, the silence of our supper was interrupted when I asked my father this question. Pa, how far is Kentucky? Well, I may as well have exploded a bomb. For an instant there was complete silence, and then my oldest sister giggled. The two little ones stared at me. With a half-hearted laugh, my father said, Well, now I don't know, but it's a pretty good ways. What do you want to know that for? You thinking about taking a trip to Kentucky? No, I said. I just wondered. My biggest sister giggled and asked, Can I go with you? And I just glared at her. Mama broke into the conversation. I declare, what kind of question is that? How far it is to Kentucky? I don't know what's gotten into that mind of yours lately. You go around like you were lost, and you're losing weight. You're as skinny as a rail, and look at that hair. Just last Sunday when they had a hair cutting over at Tom Rowland's place, but you wouldn't go. You had to go prowling around in the river and in the woods. I told Mama that I'd get a haircut the next time they had a cutting, and I just heard from some fellas talking about Kentucky up at the store, and I wondered how far away it was. Much to my relief, that conversation died. The days dragged by, and a week passed, and still no word about my dogs. Terrible thoughts ran through my mind. Maybe my dogs were lost. Maybe the train had a wreck. Someone stole my money. Or perhaps the mailman lost my order. Then, at the end of the second week, my notice came. My grandfather told me that he had talked to Mr. Jim Hodges that day. He was going into town in about a week and that I could ride with him to pick up the dogs. Again, I thanked my grandfather. I started for home, walking along in deep thought. I decided it was time to tell my father the whole story. I fully intended to tell him that evening, and I tried several times, but somehow I just couldn't. I wasn't scared of him, for he never whipped me. He was always kind and gentle, but for some reason, I don't know why, I just couldn't tell him. That night, I snuggled deep in the soft folds of my feather bed, and I lay thinking. I had waited so long for my dogs, and I so desperately wanted to see them and hold them. I didn't want to wait a whole week. In a flash, I made up my mind. Very quickly, I got up and put on my clothes. I sneaked into the kitchen and got one of Mama's precious flour sacks. In it, I put 6 eggs, some leftover cornbread, a little salt, and a few matches. Next, I went to the smokehouse and cut off a piece of salt pork. I stopped in the barn and picked up a gunny sack. I put the flour sack inside the gunny sack. This I rolled up and crammed lengthwise in the bib of my overalls. I was on my way. I was going after my dogs. Tahlequah was a small country town with a population of about 800. By the road, it was 32 miles away, but as the crow flies, it was only 20 miles. I went as the way the crow flies, straight through the hills. Although I had never been to town in my life, I knew what direction to take. Tahlequah and the railroad lay on either side of the river from our place. I had Frisco Railroad on my right, and I had the Illinois River on my left. Not far from where the railroad crossed the river lay the town of Tahlequah. I knew if I bore to the right, I would find the railroad, and if I bore to the left, I had the river to guide me. Sometime that night, I crossed the river on a rifle somewhere in the Dripping Springs country. Coming out of the river bottoms, I scadded up a long hogback ridge and broke out on top of the flats. In a mile-eating trot, I moved along. I had the wind of a deer, the muscles of a country boy, and a heart full of dog love and a strong determination. I wasn't scared of the darkness or the mountains, for I was raised in those mountains. On and on, mile after mile, I moved along. I saw faint gray streaks appear in the east. I knew that daylight was close. My bare feet were getting sore from the flint rocks and the saw briars. I stopped beside a mountain stream, soaked my feet in the cool water, and rested for a spell, and then started on. After leaving the mountain stream, my pace was much slower. My muscles of my legs were getting stiff. Feeling the pangs of hunger gnawing at my stomach, I decided I would stop and eat at the next stream I found. Then I remembered I had forgotten to include a can in which to boil my eggs. I stopped and built a small fire, cutting off a nice thick slab of salt pork. I roasted it and with a piece of cornbread made a sandwich. Putting out my fire, I was on my way again. I ate as I trotted and I felt much better. I came into the town of Tahlequah. I came into Tahlequah from the northeast at the outskirts of town. I hid my flour sack and provisions, keeping the gunny sack, and I walked into town. I was scared of Tahlequah and the people. I had never seen such a big town and so many people. There was store after store, some of them 2 stories high. The wagon yard had wagons on top of wagons, teams, buggies, and horses. 2 young ladies about my age stared at me and then giggled. My blood boiled, but I couldn't understand. After all, I had 3 sisters. They couldn't help it because they were just women folk, and I went on. Then I saw a big man coming up the street. The bright, shiny star on his vest looked as big as a bucket. I saw the long black gun at his side, and I froze in my tracks. I'd heard of sheriffs and marshals, but I never saw one before. Stories repeated about them in the mountains told how fast they were with a gun and how many men they had killed. The closer he came, the more frightened I got. I knew it was for the end for me. I just could see him aiming his big black gun and shooting me right between the eyes. It seemed like every miracle that passed by, hardly glancing at me. Breathing a sigh, I walked on, seeing the wonders of the world. I'm going to stop right here. This was part 1 of chapter 4, and in just a second I will start with part 2 of chapter 4, and I will see y'all in just a second.